Beirut, Lebanon, September 7, 1979, 8:15 in the morning. A man in his late 20s walks into the offices of Al-Nahar, one of the most influential Arabic-language newspapers in the Middle East, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a carefully pressed suit. His name is Samir Haddad, at least that's what his Lebanese passport says. And today is his first day as a junior political correspondent. He's nervous, which makes sense for someone starting a prestigious new job. What his new colleagues don't know is that Samir's nervousness has nothing to do with journalistic performance. He's terrified because he's not actually Lebanese. He's an Israeli intelligence officer, and he's just walked into one of Mossad's most ambitious long-term infiltration operations ever conceived. For the next 7 years, he'll come to this office every single day. He'll write articles, develop sources, attend editorial meetings, and make friends with people who would kill him if they knew who he really was. And the information he'll gather will give Israel unprecedented insight into Arab political thinking, diplomatic maneuvering, and the inner workings of media organizations that shaped Middle Eastern public opinion during one of the most volatile periods in the region's modern history. This is the story of one of the longest-running deep-cover operations in modern intelligence history. How Mossad created a completely fake identity that withstood 7 years of scrutiny in a hostile environment. How one agent lived a double life so convincing that his colleagues trusted him with sensitive information and personal confidences. How Israeli intelligence turned a newspaper office into an intelligence collection platform without anyone noticing. And here's what makes this absolutely insane. The agent didn't just pretend to be a journalist. He became one. He wrote hundreds of articles that were published under his cover name. He broke real stories. He built genuine relationships with sources across the Arab world. He was so good at his cover job that he was promoted twice and became one of the newspaper's most respected political analysts. The line between cover and reality became so blurred that even he sometimes forgot which version of himself was real. Let me take you back to 1977. The Middle East was in a state of constant tension and uncertainty. Egypt and Israel had just begun secret peace negotiations that would eventually lead to the Camp David Accords. Syria remained actively hostile. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was conducting operations from Lebanon, and newspapers like Al-Nahar were critical intelligence targets because they weren't just reporting news, they were helping shape it in profound ways. Major newspapers in Beirut had become hubs where politicians, diplomats, intelligence officers, and militant leaders all intersected. Journalists had access to people and information that intelligence agencies desperately wanted to obtain. If you could place an agent inside a major newspaper, you wouldn't just be monitoring the news. You'd be positioned at the center of the region's entire information ecosystem, with access to people and conversations that would otherwise be completely impossible for Israeli intelligence to reach. Al-Nahar was one of the most influential publications in the Arab world, founded in 1933 and known for its relatively independent editorial stance and its extensive network of correspondents across the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. By the late 1970s, it had become required reading for anyone trying to understand Arab politics. Diplomats read it every morning. Intelligence services from multiple countries monitored it carefully. Political leaders used it to send messages to each other through carefully worded editorials and strategically leaked information. But the newspaper's real intelligence value went far beyond what appeared in print. The journalists who worked there had extraordinary access that governments would pay fortunes to obtain. They maintained relationships with government officials who would speak candidly off the record about sensitive policy matters. They traveled to conflict zones and refugee camps where they heard things that never made it into published articles. They attended diplomatic receptions and political gatherings where sensitive information was shared informally. And crucially, other intelligence operatives used journalist credentials as cover for their own activities, which meant a real journalist working at Al-Nahar would inevitably encounter spies pretending to be reporters. For Israel, having an agent inside Al-Nahar would provide multiple intelligence advantages that traditional espionage methods simply couldn't match. First, advanced knowledge of stories before publication, particularly those based on leaked government documents or diplomatic cables that revealed policy decisions. Second, identification of sources, understanding who was talking to journalists and what they were willing to reveal about government thinking. Third, access to the newspaper's broader network, introductions to politicians, military officers, and other journalists across the region that would be impossible for an Israeli to obtain otherwise. Fourth, the ability to subtly influence coverage through editorial discussions and story suggestions. And fifth, perhaps most valuable, a legitimate reason to be present in spaces where intelligence could be collected naturally through observation and conversation. A journalist asking questions raises no suspicion whatsoever because that's literally what journalists do for a living. But infiltrating a major newspaper was extraordinarily difficult and carried enormous risks for everyone involved. These organizations were careful about who they hired, particularly for political coverage positions that required security clearances and government access. They conducted thorough background checks. They verified credentials through academic institutions and previous employers. They watched new hires carefully during probationary periods, looking for anything unusual. And Lebanon in the late 1970s was a complex, dangerous environment where intelligence services from multiple countries were operating aggressively, which meant counterintelligence awareness was extremely high among journalists and editors. Newspaper editors knew that intelligence agencies might try to plant operatives in their organizations. They looked for inconsistencies in backgrounds, suspicious questions, unusual interest in sensitive topics beyond normal journalistic curiosity. A single mistake, one detail that didn't check out properly, one moment when the cover story fell apart under scrutiny, and the entire operation would be exposed. The agent would likely be arrested, possibly tortured for information about Mossad operations, and almost certainly killed. That's what made this operation so audacious and why it required years of meticulous preparation. Creating Samir Haddad began in 1977, 2 full years before he walked into Al-Nahar's offices for his first day of work. This wasn't a matter of forging some documents and hoping no one checked too carefully. Mossad needed to build a complete, verifiable identity that would withstand the kind of scrutiny a major newspaper would apply to any political correspondent. The agent they selected, I'll call him David, because his real name remains classified to this day, was in his mid-20s, originally from a Mizrahi Jewish family with deep roots in Iraq. This was absolutely crucial because he needed to speak Arabic natively, not as a learned language, but with the natural fluency, accent, and cultural knowledge that only comes from growing up immersed in an Arabic-speaking environment. His family had immigrated to Israel when he was young, but he'd maintained perfect Arabic through family and community connections. He could discuss Arabic poetry with educated professionals. He understood regional dialects. He could navigate complex social customs. He wasn't an Israeli pretending to be Arab. He was genuinely part of that cultural world, which made the deception sustainable over years. But language and cultural knowledge weren't nearly enough for this kind of operation. David needed a complete backstory that could be verified through documentation and actual witnesses. Mossad created Samir Haddad as a Lebanese Christian from a middle-class family in Beirut. The choice of Christian identity was strategically important because it explained why Samir might have less political baggage than a Muslim Lebanese journalist, and why his family history wouldn't be as thoroughly documented in religious and community records. The legend placed his childhood in a neighborhood that had been heavily damaged during Lebanon's civil war, which conveniently explained why certain records were missing or destroyed. His family history was crafted to be believable, but difficult to fully verify, claiming his father had been a small business owner who died in the early 1970s, and his mother had relatives in Europe where Samir had supposedly spent several years. The education component was absolutely critical to making this work. Samir's legend included a degree from the American University of Beirut, one of the region's most prestigious and well-respected institutions. But Mossad couldn't just forge a diploma and hope no one actually checked. They needed the university's records to actually show that Samir Haddad had attended and graduated. This required a sophisticated operation where Mossad operatives gained access to the university's administrative systems and inserted Samir's complete academic record into their files. They created course enrollments, grades, and even professor comments that would appear if anyone requested his official transcripts. They backdated all the entries to make them consistent with the exact time period when Samir would have supposedly been a student there. It was an enormous amount of painstaking work, but it meant that if Al-Nahar contacted the university to verify his credentials, the records would confirm absolutely everything he claimed about his educational background. By mid-1979, Samir Haddad's legend was solid enough to put into operational use. Al-Nahar had an opening for a political correspondent, advertised through the usual channels of academic networks and journalism associations throughout Lebanon and the region. The position required native Arabic fluency, obviously, strong writing skills, deep political knowledge, and preferably some international experience covering regional affairs. Samir's legend fit the requirements perfectly, almost too perfectly, but that created its own significant problem. If he appeared too perfect, too conveniently qualified for exactly this position, it might raise immediate suspicion among security-conscious editors. Intelligence officers reviewing his application might wonder whether his background was too clean, too precisely tailored to what the newspaper needed. So Mossad had to make Samir's application good, but not suspiciously perfect. They included small imperfections in his resume, gaps in employment that could be explained by family circumstances, and a writing portfolio that showed genuine talent, but also the rough edges of a developing journalist, not someone who seemed impossibly polished. David, operating as Samir, submitted his application through completely normal channels along with dozens of other qualified candidates. He didn't use any connections or attempt to bypass standard procedures. He wanted to be evaluated on exactly the same basis as everyone else, because that would make his eventual hiring appear completely legitimate to anyone who might later review the process. His application materials included writing samples from his supposed previous work, articles that had actually been written by Mossad personnel with journalism backgrounds and then published under Samir's name in the smaller Lebanese publications where his legend showed previous employment. The articles were professionally good, well-written, but not extraordinary. They demonstrated political awareness, balanced analysis, and the kind of access to mid-level sources that a young correspondent would reasonably have developed over several years of work. When Al-Nahar called him for an interview, David prepared extensively and methodically. He studied the newspaper's recent coverage in detail, understanding their editorial positions and reporting priorities. He researched the editors who would interview him, learning their professional backgrounds and political perspectives. He rehearsed answers to likely questions, but not to the point where his responses would sound memorized or unnatural. The interview needed to feel natural, spontaneous, like a genuine conversation between journalists, rather than a carefully rehearsed performance. On the day of his interview, he arrived slightly early, but not excessively so. He dressed professionally, but not ostentatiously. He was polite to administrative staff, friendly, but not overly familiar. Every single detail of his behavior was carefully calculated to present someone who was competent, likable, and unremarkable in ways that might raise questions or concerns. The interview itself went well, though David, thinking as Samir throughout, had to navigate several potentially challenging moments. The senior political editor asked specific questions about his time at the American University of Beirut, particularly which professors he'd studied under for political science courses. David was fully prepared for this exact question, naming professors who had actually taught political science during the precise period when Samir would have been a student. The editor nodded with recognition, clearly familiar with those names. Then came careful questions about Samir's own political views, a subtle attempt to understand whether he had strong ideological commitments that might bias his reporting. David responded carefully and thoughtfully, acknowledging the immense complexity of Lebanese politics, expressing sympathy for various perspectives, while emphasizing his deep commitment to objective journalism above all. Samir Haddad was officially hired, and that's when the real operation truly began in earnest. The first few months were by far the most dangerous, because new employees are always watched carefully by their colleagues. People pay close attention to how you work, whether your skills actually match your resume claims, whether you seem genuinely comfortable in the role or awkward in ways that suggest deception. Any inconsistency, any moment when the cover slips even slightly, could trigger serious suspicion that would lead to investigation. David understood completely that his survival depended on being genuinely excellent at journalism, not just pretending to do the job while actually collecting intelligence on the side. So he threw himself into the work with total, complete commitment. He arrived early every morning, stayed late most evenings, volunteered enthusiastically for difficult assignments, built strong relationships with sources throughout the region, and wrote articles that went through exactly the same rigorous editorial process as everyone else's work. He wasn't coasting on his cover identity. He was actually performing as a legitimate political correspondent, because that's what made the cover sustainable over years. The psychological challenge was absolutely immense in ways that are difficult for outsiders to fully comprehend. Every single morning David woke up and had to become Samir completely and convincingly. He couldn't afford even brief moments of forgetfulness where he responded to his real name or revealed knowledge he shouldn't possess. He had to think like Samir, react like Samir, maintain Samir's political views and personal history in every single conversation, no matter how casual. And because he was working in an office full of highly intelligent, naturally observant people who made their entire living asking probing questions and noticing inconsistent details, the pressure was absolutely constant. He developed genuine friendships with colleagues, people he genuinely liked and deeply respected as professionals, knowing that these relationships were built on a fundamental deception. He attended their family gatherings, celebrated their professional successes, supported them through personal difficulties, all while hiding who he really was at the most basic level. The intelligence collection itself had to be extremely subtle and purely opportunistic. David couldn't be caught photographing sensitive documents or asking obvious intelligence questions that had no journalistic purpose. Instead, he leveraged his completely legitimate journalistic activities for intelligence purposes. When he interviewed a Syrian diplomat about regional politics for a feature article, he was genuinely gathering information for publication, but he was also simultaneously collecting intelligence about Syrian government thinking and internal policy debates. When he attended a political reception where PLO officials were present as guests, he was there as a working journalist covering the event for his newspaper, but he was also carefully observing security arrangements, identifying key personnel, and noting who was talking to whom about what sensitive topics. The intelligence flowed naturally and organically from his cover job, because political journalism and intelligence collection overlap significantly in terms of the information they seek. The crucial difference is purpose and reporting channels. Mossad established a complex, multi-layered communication protocol for David to report intelligence without exposing his cover to any surveillance. He couldn't simply call a handler or meet with Israeli intelligence officers operating in Lebanon. Lebanon was full of hostile surveillance from multiple services, and any suspicious contact would be immediately noticed and investigated. Instead, David used a series of dead drops, encrypted messages hidden in seemingly innocent communications, and extremely rare face-to-face meetings with handlers who entered Lebanon under their own elaborate covers. When he had critical, time-sensitive information, he would place classified advertisements in European newspapers using pre-arranged coded language that his handlers monitored continuously. The information David collected over his 7 years inside Al-Nahar fell into several distinct categories, each valuable for different strategic reasons. First came the incredibly valuable early warning intelligence about major stories before they were actually published. Major newspapers like Al-Nahar often received leaked government documents, classified diplomatic cables, or highly sensitive information from sources within various Arab governments. When a journalist was working on a story based on such explosive leaks, there would typically be days or even weeks between receiving the information and actually publishing it. Time spent meticulously verifying facts, checking with additional sources, and getting final editorial approval. David had advance access to these developing stories through regular editorial meetings and casual conversations with colleagues working on sensitive material. If a story was going to reveal Syrian military movements near the Golan Heights, or Egyptian diplomatic initiatives regarding Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, or Saudi funding for certain political movements, David knew well before publication and reported it immediately to Mossad through secure channels. This gave Israeli intelligence crucial time to analyze the information deeply, adjust their own operations accordingly, and prepare appropriate diplomatic or military responses. Second was source identification, which proved extraordinarily valuable over time. Journalists protect their sources fiercely, but within newsrooms, reporters often discuss their source networks with trusted colleagues, seeking advice on how to approach a particular government official or sharing contact information for someone who might be helpful on another related story. David learned systematically who was talking to whom, which government officials were willing to leak sensitive information, which military officers were sufficiently disgruntled to provide classified material, which political figures used the media strategically to advance personal agendas. This information was pure gold for Mossad because it revealed significant vulnerabilities in opposing governments, officials who might potentially be recruited as agents, and channels through which carefully crafted disinformation could be planted when needed. Third was the ongoing identification of other intelligence operatives working under journalist cover. Journalists are used as cover identities by intelligence services worldwide, and experienced reporters often develop strong suspicions when a colleague might be more than they appear to be. David noticed telling patterns that suggested certain individuals in the regional journalism community were probably intelligence officers using journalist credentials as convenient cover. A correspondent who asked strangely specific questions about Israeli security measures far beyond normal reporting needs. A photographer who seemed far more interested in photographing military installations than in the human interest stories he supposedly was covering. A freelance reporter whose supposed freelance work didn't generate many actual published articles, but who traveled extensively to highly sensitive locations. David reported these suspicions to Mossad, which then conducted additional investigation to confirm whether these individuals were indeed operatives, and if so, which intelligence service they actually worked for. Fourth was privileged access to the newspaper's extensive document collections and archives. Newspapers maintain vast files of clippings, photographs, contact information, and background research materials accumulated over decades. David had completely legitimate access to these archives for his own work, but he also systematically used this access to gather pure intelligence. Historical files on political figures revealed their hidden connections, their financial dealings, their personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Photographic archives included valuable images of military facilities, government buildings, and political events that had significant intelligence value. Contact databases showed the complex relationships between journalists and sources across the entire region, essentially a detailed network map that Israeli intelligence could analyze carefully for operational opportunities. 7 years is an extraordinarily, almost impossibly long time to maintain deep cover in such a hostile environment without serious problems. The law of averages strongly suggests that something will eventually go wrong. Some detail will inevitably slip. Some piece of the elaborate cover will fail to hold up under sustained scrutiny. David experienced several genuinely close calls that could easily have exposed everything and gotten him killed. The first came about 18 months into the operation, when a colleague casually mentioned that his cousin had also attended the American University of Beirut during exactly the same period when Samir supposedly studied there. The colleague enthusiastically suggested they all get together, reminisce about professors and campus life. Maybe the cousin would actually remember Samir from shared classes or social events. David couldn't refuse, outright, without appearing extremely suspicious. So he agreed to the meeting while immediately reporting the dangerous situation to his Mossad handlers through emergency protocols. The handlers worked frantically to gather every possible detail about the university during that specific period: student life, campus buildings, social dynamics, anything David might need to discuss convincingly. The meeting happened at a popular Beirut cafe on a Thursday evening. The colleague's cousin was friendly and enthusiastic about finding someone who'd been at AUB during his time there. He asked which dormitory Samir had lived in. David named one that actually existed and gave accurate details about its location and interior layout that he'd carefully memorized. The cousin nodded, saying he'd lived in a completely different building, but knew the one Samir described. Then came detailed questions about specific professors, particular courses, memorable campus events. David had prepared as carefully as possible, but there were inevitable limits to what could be anticipated. When the cousin mentioned a particular student protest that had supposedly happened during their time there, David had to improvise skillfully, saying he remembered hearing about it but hadn't been directly involved because he was intensely focused on his studies and working part-time to support himself financially. The excuse worked well, explaining why his memory might be somewhat hazier than someone who'd been more socially active on campus. The evening ended with vague promises to get together again soon, which David made absolutely sure never actually happened by claiming pressing work commitments whenever the colleague suggested another meeting. Another serious close call involved a Lebanese intelligence officer who'd taken particular interest in David's political reporting. Lebanese intelligence services routinely monitored journalists, particularly those covering sensitive political and security issues. An officer approached David at a political event, striking up what seemed like casual conversation, but was clearly a deliberate evaluative encounter. He complimented Samir's recent articles with specific details, then asked probing questions about his background, his political views, his sources. David recognized the encounter immediately for exactly what it was, a direct intelligence assessment. He responded carefully, being friendly but not overly eager to please, acknowledging the officer's interest while deflecting questions about sources with the standard journalist's protection of confidentiality. The officer seemed satisfied, but Mossad's careful analysis of the encounter suggested that Lebanese intelligence had likely opened an active file on Samir, not because they specifically suspected him of being an Israeli agent, but because they routinely monitored all journalists who covered sensitive topics. David now had to assume he was under occasional surveillance, which meant implementing even more careful operational security. The absolute closest call came in year 5, when an administrative error at the American University of Beirut briefly exposed a significant problem with Samir's academic records. A meticulous university staff member noticed subtle inconsistencies in database entries dating back to Samir's supposed enrollment period. The irregularities were quite subtle, formatting differences suggesting the records might have been entered significantly later than the dates they actually referenced. The staff member reported this to university security, which began investigating whether records had been tampered with. Mossad learned about the investigation through a different asset who had access to university security reports. If the investigation concluded that Samir Haddad's records were fraudulent, Al-Nahar would be immediately notified, and David's cover would collapse instantly and catastrophically. The intelligence David provided over his 7 years inside Al-Nahar was consistently valuable and occasionally absolutely critical to Israeli strategic decisions. There were specific moments when his reporting directly influenced Israeli strategic decisions at the very highest levels of government. In 1982, when Israel was actively preparing to invade southern Lebanon to push back the PLO, David reported extremely detailed information about PLO command structures, the precise locations of weapons depots, and significant internal divisions within the organization that Israeli military planners used extensively to design their operations. He'd gathered this through his completely legitimate journalistic work, interviewing PLO officials for feature articles and carefully observing their security arrangements during press events. The information he provided helped Israeli forces target leadership figures far more effectively and avoid unnecessary civilian casualties by understanding clearly where PLO operations were actually based versus where ordinary civilians lived. In 1983, David reported that Syrian intelligence was actively planning to assassinate a prominent Lebanese politician who was considered dangerously close to Israel. He'd learned this from a Syrian diplomatic source who'd mentioned it during an off-the-record conversation, mistakenly thinking he was speaking to a trusted Lebanese journalist who shared strong anti-Israeli sentiments. Mossad passed the specific warning to the Lebanese politician through carefully indirect channels. The politician immediately increased his security significantly and changed his daily routines. The assassination attempt was made several weeks later, but failed completely. The politician survived, and he never knew that his life had been saved by intelligence gathered by an Israeli agent posing as a Lebanese journalist he'd probably met at political events. In 1984, David identified a French journalist working in Beirut who was actually an operative for France's Directorate General of External Security, their foreign intelligence service. The French operative was gathering intelligence on Israeli activities in Lebanon and coordinating with certain Lebanese factions. By identifying this operative conclusively, Mossad was able to feed carefully crafted disinformation through channels that would eventually reach French intelligence, misleading them significantly about Israeli intentions and actual capabilities. The French operative, believing he had excellent sources within Lebanese political circles, reported the false information to Paris, where it influenced French government policy decisions in ways that significantly benefited Israeli strategic interests. Perhaps the single most significant intelligence came in 1985, when David learned through careful conversations with a well-connected Lebanese politician who genuinely trusted him that Libya was actively negotiating to purchase advanced Soviet surface-to-air missiles that could seriously threaten Israeli aircraft operating over Lebanon and Syria. The politician mentioned this during an interview, not realizing he was revealing highly classified information. David reported it immediately through emergency protocols. Mossad conducted additional investigation, confirmed the intelligence completely, and Israeli operatives successfully disrupted the entire arms transfer before the missiles could be delivered to Libya. The operation prevented a major upgrade in hostile air defense capabilities that would have complicated Israeli military options for many years. Throughout all of this sustained intelligence collection, David continued performing his cover job at the absolute highest professional level. He won journalism awards for his political reporting and analysis. He was promoted from junior correspondent to senior political analyst. His colleagues respected him professionally and genuinely liked him personally. He was regularly invited to their homes, trusted with personal confidences, included fully in the newsroom's social life. And every single day, he systematically betrayed that trust by reporting to Israeli intelligence. By 1986, David had been operating continuously as Samir Haddad for 7 full years, and truly remarkable and almost unprecedented run for a deep cover operation in such an extraordinarily hostile environment. But Mossad's experienced counterintelligence analysts were becoming increasingly concerned about the long-term sustainability of his position and his safety. The longer any operation ran, the higher the cumulative statistical risk of exposure became. Detailed statistical analysis of historical intelligence operations suggested that deep cover agents operating in hostile environments had a useful operational life of approximately 5 to 7 years maximum before various accumulating factors increased exposure risk to genuinely unacceptable levels. Things like changes in personal circumstances that might require new documentation, rapidly evolving surveillance technologies that made operational security increasingly difficult, and the inevitable accumulation of small anomalies that individually seemed completely innocent, but collectively could form a recognizable pattern that counterintelligence might eventually detect. David was rapidly approaching the dangerous edge of that statistical window. There were several specific warning signs that couldn't be ignored. Lebanese intelligence had significantly intensified their monitoring of journalists, following several embarrassing security leaks that had appeared in the regional press. David noticed increased surveillance of his activities, not constant but distinctly periodic, suggesting strongly he was on an active watch list of journalists whose activities were being monitored more closely than before. Additionally, Al-Nahar was planning a comprehensive staff security review as part of broader organizational changes under new management. The review would include updated background checks on all employees, using significantly improved investigative methods that might potentially detect subtle inconsistencies in legends that had been carefully created years earlier with less sophisticated verification technologies. And personally, David was showing clear signs of serious psychological strain. 7 years of maintaining a completely false identity without any break, 7 years of constant vigilance, 7 years of daily deception with people he genuinely cared about takes an enormous toll that even the best psychological training can't fully prepare someone to handle indefinitely. Mossad made the difficult but necessary decision to extract him, not because of any specific immediate threat, but because the overall risk-benefit calculation had shifted dramatically. The intelligence he was providing remained valuable, but it wasn't critical enough to justify the increasing danger to his life. They began carefully planning his departure, which absolutely had to appear completely natural and routine. If Samir Haddad suddenly disappeared without explanation, it would trigger intensive investigations that might expose the entire operation, even after David was safely evacuated. They needed a thoroughly plausible explanation for why he'd leave Lebanon, a compelling reason that his colleagues would accept without any suspicion. The solution was to create a career opportunity simply too attractive to refuse. Mossad arranged through a complicated series of intermediary contacts for a prestigious European think tank specializing in Middle Eastern affairs to offer Samir a position as a senior research fellow. The position came with a significant salary increase, considerable prestige, and the opportunity to work in a far more stable environment than Lebanon's ongoing political instability offered. The offer was genuine in the sense that the think tank actually existed and actually extended the formal offer, though the think tank's director had been carefully maneuvered into making it through recommendations from several people he respected who were actually Mossad assets. When David, as Samir, received the impressive offer, he discussed it openly with his colleagues at Al-Nahar. They were genuinely disappointed to lose him. He'd become a truly valued member of the team, but they completely understood the appeal of the opportunity. It was exactly the kind of career advancement that any ambitious journalist would naturally pursue. He gave 2 months' notice, providing plenty of time for the newspaper to find a suitable replacement and for him to train his successor thoroughly on his source network and story files. David left Beirut in late 1986, his cover completely intact, his dangerous mission successfully accomplished. He flew to Europe, worked briefly at the think tank to maintain his cover identity, then quietly disappeared from public life, with extensive help from Mossad's identity management specialists. Samir Haddad's professional correspondence gradually declined as his European colleagues received fewer and fewer responses to their friendly messages. Eventually, people naturally assumed he'd moved on to other work, or perhaps returned to Lebanon. In reality, David had returned to Israel, undergone extensive psychological debriefing to help him process 7 intense years of living a false identity, and eventually resumed his life under his real name. Years later, some of his published articles written as Samir Haddad were included in academic anthologies about Middle Eastern journalism and political coverage. Scholars cited his analytical work without knowing the author was an Israeli intelligence officer. The irony would have amused him if it didn't also highlight the strange duality of what he'd accomplished professionally. The operation demonstrated both the immense power and the significant cost of long-term deep-cover intelligence work. The power is obvious. David provided Israel with sustained, consistently high-quality intelligence from the heart of Arab media operations for 7 full years. He influenced events, saved lives, identified threats, and gave Israeli decision-makers strategic advantages they couldn't have obtained any other way. But the cost was equally significant. David spent his mid-20s to early 30s living an elaborate lie, building relationships he knew were fundamentally false, earning trust he was betraying daily. The psychological impact of that kind of sustained deception is genuinely profound. Intelligence agencies study it carefully because they need to understand both the remarkable operational capabilities that long-term cover provides and the human limitations that eventually make such operations psychologically unsustainable. For the intelligence community, operations like this represent a particular category of tradecraft that's fundamentally different from the dramatic operations movies typically portray. There's no violence, no high-speed chases, no last-second escapes, just a man going to an office every single day for 7 years, doing a job well enough to be genuinely respected by colleagues who never knew they were working alongside an enemy intelligence officer. That's the reality of much intelligence work. Patient, methodical, psychologically demanding, and effective, precisely because it's so mundane that it raises absolutely no suspicion. The infiltration of Al-Nahar worked because David was genuinely excellent at journalism. The cover wasn't a costume. It was a professional skill he developed and performed at a level that earned him credibility and access. Intelligence agencies continue to use media infiltration as an operational method. Journalists have access that intelligence officers operating under official cover simply can't obtain. They can ask probing questions without triggering suspicion. They travel to sensitive locations with completely legitimate purpose. They develop source networks that provide information beyond what any single interview would reveal. And most importantly, they operate in the open, building detailed profiles that can withstand scrutiny because they're doing exactly what they claim to be doing. The challenge is maintaining the cover over extended time, handling the psychological pressure, and eventually extracting the agent before the accumulation of risks leads to catastrophic exposure. Somewhere in Mossad's classified archives, there's a complete file on the Samir Haddad operation. It contains the original legend development plans, the communication protocols David used, the intelligence reports he filed, the analysis of close calls he survived, and the psychological assessments conducted after his extraction. The file is classified at a level that ensures it won't be available to researchers for decades. But it represents 7 years of a man's life dedicated to a single intelligence mission, 7 years of articles written under a false name, 7 years of friendships built on deception, 7 years of professional achievement in a career that wasn't really his, and the strange legacy of work that remains published under a name that never belonged to a real person. That's the reality of deep cover intelligence operations. Subscribe for more intelligence operations.